Every great fortune in history eventually collapses. Kingdoms are conquered. Dynasties die out. Banks fail. Empires rot from within. That is the universal law of wealth and power. The Vatican has defied it for 2,000 years. Stripped of its territories by Napoleon, rocked by financial scandals that brought down banks across Europe, besieged by reformers, revolutionaries, and rival faiths, it has lost battles, lost land, and lost credibility, and yet today it remains the single richest institution on earth. The secret to that survival is not divine protection. It is a 2-millennium masterclass in financial strategy, political maneuvering, and institutional reinvention that has never been fully examined in one place. In this documentary, we lay it all out. The medieval land empires and the indulgence markets, the Renaissance banking dynasties and the Cold War financial networks, the scandals and the cover-ups and the quiet, relentless accumulation of wealth that has made a city smaller than a golf course into a power that no nation on earth has ever been able to ignore. 2,000 years ago, in the cramped tenements and smoky back streets of imperial Rome, a small group of men and women gathered in secret. They had no temple, no treasury, no land. What they had was a story, and an unshakable belief that the story was true. Christianity arrived in Rome not with fanfare but with whispers. Followers of a crucified Jewish preacher from Galilee, they were regarded by Roman authorities as little more than a troublesome sect, their beliefs strange, their loyalty to the empire suspect. They met in private homes and underground chambers, in the darkness beneath the city itself. And yet, somehow, they endured. The earliest Christian communities in Rome operated on a radical economic principle. The book of Acts describes it plainly. The faithful sold their possessions and goods, sharing everything according to each member's need. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was a complete pooling of resources, a communal treasury sustained by voluntary surrender. Wealthy converts donated property. Poor members received support. The community became, in effect, its own self-sustaining financial organism. It was a modest beginning, but it established a precedent that would echo across 20 centuries. Among those who made their way to Rome was a fisherman from Galilee named Simon Peter. Tradition holds that Peter served as the leader of Rome's Christian community, preaching through the reign of the Emperor Nero. Then, around 64 AD, fire tore through Rome. Nero needed a scapegoat. The Christians, already despised, were the obvious choice. What followed was savage. Believers were executed in spectacles of public cruelty, and Peter himself, according to church tradition, was crucified on Vatican Hill, just across the Tiber from the city's heart. At his own request, he was crucified upside down, unwilling to claim equality with Christ in death. Peter's burial site would become the foundation, quite literally, of everything that followed. Christians marked the spot and considered it sacred ground. They returned to it, prayed over it, protected it. In an empire that worshipped power and permanence, this small patch of earth on Vatican Hill became the spiritual center of a growing movement. The catacombs beneath Rome tell a similar story. These vast underground networks, carved from soft volcanic rock called tufa, served as burial grounds for thousands of early Christians. Maintaining them required organization, resources, and money. The church administered these spaces, collecting fees for burial plots and accepting donations from grieving families. The catacombs were, in a very real sense, the church's first real estate holdings, underground acres of sacred property in the capital of the ancient world. From a fisherman's grave and a network of underground tunnels, an institution was quietly taking shape. It had no army, no emperor, no treasury of gold. But it had something more durable than all of those things combined. It had the loyalty of its people and their willingness to give. Everything changed in the winter of 313 AD with a single document signed in Milan. The Edict of Milan, issued jointly by Emperor Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, did not merely tolerate Christianity. It welcomed it. After nearly 3 centuries of persecution, of hidden gatherings and underground graves, the faith of fishermen and slaves was suddenly, astonishingly, legal. More than legal. It was favored. Constantine's conversion remains one of history's most debated transformations. Whether driven by genuine spiritual awakening or cold political calculation, the emperor had seen at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 what he believed was a divine sign. He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. He won. And the church, from that moment forward, would never be the same institution again. What followed was nothing short of an imperial flood of generosity. Constantine did not simply protect the church. He enriched it on a scale no Christian community had ever imagined possible. Within years of the edict, he granted the church vast estates across the empire, properties generating annual incomes that dwarfed the wealth of most Roman aristocrats. The church received land in Italy, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, productive agricultural holdings that would generate revenue for generations. Tax exemptions followed. Clergy were freed from the civic financial obligations that burdened ordinary Romans. Church property was shielded from imperial taxation. At a stroke, Constantine had given the institution both a revenue stream and a shield around it. Then came the buildings. Constantine commissioned the original Basilica of St. Peter, constructed over the traditional burial site of the Apostle on Vatican Hill, the same sacred ground early Christians had quietly protected for centuries. The project required moving enormous quantities of earth, demolishing a pagan cemetery, and constructing one of the largest religious buildings the Roman world had ever seen. Simultaneously, Constantine donated his wife's Lateran palace to the Bishop of Rome, a gesture of staggering significance. The bishop, who would eventually be known as the Pope, now had a palace. An institution born in borrowed rooms and underground tunnels suddenly had an imperial residence. The church's property holdings expanded rapidly throughout the 4th century. Wealthy converts, inspired by Constantine's example, donated estates. Dying Romans left land and treasure to local congregations. What had once been a network of small, scattered communities pooling modest resources was becoming a continental landowner of serious consequence. But perhaps the most remarkable chapter in this story of accumulation was written not by Constantine himself, but by a document that claimed to be his. Sometime in the 8th century, an unknown author produced a text called the Donation of Constantine. It purported to be a decree from the emperor himself, granting Pope Sylvester I and all his successors dominion over Rome, Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire. Constantine, the document claimed, had personally surrendered imperial authority to the papacy in gratitude for his miraculous cure from leprosy. It was a forgery, brilliantly constructed, but utterly false. The Italian scholar Lorenzo Valla would prove this definitively in 1440, noting that the document's Latin reflected vocabulary and usage that did not exist in Constantine's era. But for roughly 600 years before Valla's exposure, popes wielded the donation as justification for sweeping territorial and political claims. It shaped the medieval map of Europe. It legitimized papal wars. It made possible the Papal States, that swath of central Italian territory ruled directly by the Church for more than 1,000 years. Constantine had given the Church land, money, buildings, and legal protection. A forger working in his name gave it something arguably more powerful still, a claim to earthly empire. By the time Constantine died in 337 AD, the transformation was complete. The persecuted faith of a Galilean fisherman had become the favored religion of the most powerful empire on earth, with property to match. The question now was what the Church would do with this extraordinary inheritance, and how much further its ambitions would reach. When the last Roman emperor in the West, the teenage Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD, no trumpets marked the occasion. No catastrophic battle. No dramatic final siege. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer simply sent the boy into comfortable exile and declined to appoint a successor. The office of Western Roman Emperor, which had shaped the known world for 5 centuries, simply ceased to exist. Into that silence stepped the Church. Rome itself was a city in visible decline. Its population, once perhaps 1 million strong, had collapsed to a fraction of that. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Granaries stood empty. The elaborate administrative machinery that had fed, policed, and governed the eternal city was rusting without the empire that had built it. And yet one institution remained with functioning records, educated administrators, and deep roots in every corner of the former empire. The Roman Church had outlasted Rome. The papacy had already demonstrated what it was capable of under pressure. In 452 AD, with Attila the Hun marching toward Rome and the imperial government essentially helpless, it was Pope Leo I who rode out to meet him at the river Mincio. What was said between the leader of the Huns and the Bishop of Rome remains unknown, but Attila turned his armies around. 3 years later, when the Vandal king Gaiseric arrived at the city walls with no opposition in sight, Leo negotiated again. He could not prevent the sacking, but he secured a promise that the population would not be massacred and the city would not be burned. For ordinary Romans watching from their windows, the Pope was doing what the emperors no longer could. This was the moment the papacy began its quiet transformation into something more than a spiritual office. The popes inherited the administrative skeleton of a dead empire with remarkable deliberateness. Church scribes continued copying legal texts and correspondence in Latin when the surrounding world was sliding toward illiteracy. Church officials assumed responsibility for grain distribution in Rome, a function once managed by imperial bureaucrats. Roads, aqueducts, and public buildings became the Church's practical concern, not out of grand ambition initially, but simple necessity. Someone had to manage them. The landholdings accumulated through Constantine's generosity and subsequent donations were now being organized into a sophisticated system of agricultural estates the Church called the Patrimony of St. Peter. These properties stretched across Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and the Italian peninsula, managed by Church administrators who sent revenues back to Rome. By the late 5th century, the Roman Church was functioning as something recognizable to modern eyes as a corporation with assets, administrators, income streams, and institutional memory preserved across generations. When Gregory I became Pope in 590 AD, he inherited an institution managing more than 400 separate agricultural estates. He organized their administration with the precision of a Roman senator, which, in fact, he had been before taking holy orders. Gregory fed Rome from church granaries during a catastrophic plague. He negotiated directly with Lombard kings threatening the city. He appointed church officials to govern territories where no secular authority remained. The spiritual and the temporal had become inseparable. What the barbarian kings who carved up the former empire were beginning to understand was that the church offered something they desperately needed: legitimacy, literacy, and administrative continuity. And the church, in turn, was learning to use that leverage. The question of how far that leverage could be pushed, how much land it could secure, and how much political power it could claim would define the centuries to come. By the time Gregory I died in 604 AD, he had demonstrated something the church would never forget. Land was not merely property. Land was power, permanence, and provision. The estates Gregory administered had not appeared overnight. They had accumulated across generations through gifts from the dying, bequests from the wealthy, and strategic purchases by bishops with foresight. A Roman senator in his final years, anxious about salvation, might deed his entire agricultural holding to the Church of Rome. A widow with no heirs might transfer her Sicilian olive groves to the local bishop in exchange for prayers and burial rites. Piece by piece, decade by decade, the patrimony of St. Peter grew into something that defied easy measurement. By the late 6th century, these holdings spanned thousands of square miles. Sicily alone provided staggering returns. The island's wheat fields had once fed the armies of the Republic, and now they fed Rome again, but under papal administration rather than imperial. Church estates in Sardinia produced grain and livestock. Properties in southern Gaul generated revenue in silver. Coastal holdings in North Africa, before the Arab conquests would eventually sever them, contributed to a system of income that flowed steadily back toward Rome. The mechanics of all this were deeply practical. Tenant farmers called colony worked the land under agreements that bound them to the soil across generations. They paid rents in kind in grain, oil, and wool, as well as in coin where local economies permitted. Church administrators called rectors oversaw clusters of estates, tracking income, mediating disputes, and remitting surpluses to Rome. Gregory corresponded with these administrators in extraordinary volume, his letters surviving to show a man obsessed with fair rents, honest accounting, and the welfare of tenants. He ordered that farmers not be exploited. He investigated reports of corruption. He insisted that the machinery of his estates run with something approaching justice. This was not sentimentality. It was sound management. Tenants who were ground into poverty produced less. Estates run by corrupt administrators produced less. Gregory understood, with the instincts of the senator he had once been, that sustainable extraction required sustainable conditions. And what did he do with the revenue? Here Gregory's genius becomes most visible. He poured church wealth back into Rome with deliberate purpose. Grain was distributed to the city's poor through a system of organized relief that kept thousands alive during years of plague and Lombard siege. Monasteries were founded. Aqueducts were repaired. Refugees flooding into Rome from war-torn territories were housed and fed from church resources. When Gregory sent the monk Augustine to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons in 597 AD, he funded the mission from church revenues, extending Rome's spiritual reach to the fog-wrapped islands at the edge of the known world. Every monastery founded, every mission dispatched, every road repaired reinforced the same underlying truth. The church was now the functioning government of much of the former Western Empire, and its agricultural estates were the treasury that made everything possible. The popes who followed Gregory inherited this model along with the lands that sustained it. And the lands kept growing. Frankish kings, newly converted and eager to demonstrate their Christian credentials, donated territories to the church. Noblemen continued to bequeath estates in exchange for prayers. The pattern Gregory had organized and refined would continue deepening across the coming century, drawing the papacy ever closer to an ambition that Gregory himself might have found alarming. Because managing estates and feeding the poor was one thing. But by the mid-8th century, a new question had begun to press against everything the church had built. Could the Pope govern not just land, but territory? Not just souls, but kingdoms. The question had been building for generations. By the middle of the 8th century, it demanded an answer. Pope Stephen II found himself in an impossible position in 753 AD. The Lombards were pressing southward through Italy, their armies threatening Rome with the kind of menace no prayer alone could repel. The Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, distracted by his own crises and increasingly hostile to the papacy over theological disputes, offered nothing useful. Rome was exposed, vulnerable, and desperate for a protector. Stephen looked north, toward the Franks, and made a decision that would reshape the world. Pepin the Short had recently seized the Frankish throne from the old Merovingian dynasty, and he needed something only the Pope could provide: legitimacy. A king who came to power through force was merely a usurper. A king anointed by God's representative on earth was something else entirely. Stephen crossed the Alps in the bitter winter of 753, becoming the first pope ever to set foot in the Frankish kingdom. He personally anointed Pepin, transforming a political calculation into a sacred covenant. The price of that anointing was protection. Pepin marched his armies into Italy twice, in 754 and again in 756, driving the Lombards back. Then he did something that no secular ruler had ever done on such a scale. He handed the conquered territories to the Pope, not to the emperor in Constantinople, not to any earthly lord. To St. Peter himself, as Pepin's scribes carefully recorded, in a document history would call the donation of Pepin. In a single act, approximately 20,000 square miles of central Italian territory became the Papal States. The Pope was now not merely a spiritual leader managing agricultural estates. He was a sovereign, governing cities, collecting taxes, administering justice, and commanding the kind of territorial authority that made him the equal of kings. The question posed at the end of Gregory's era had found its thundering answer. The implications cascaded forward across the following decades. If a pope could grant legitimacy to Pepin, what might he grant to someone greater still? On Christmas Day, 800 AD, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of Pepin's son. The congregation erupted with a shout that the chronicler Einhard described as rehearsed, though Charlemagne himself would later claim surprise. Whether the moment was staged or spontaneous mattered far less than what it meant. The most powerful ruler in Western Europe, commanding territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, had received his imperial title from the hands of a bishop. The papacy had just demonstrated something of incalculable value. It could make an emperor. Charlemagne proved a useful partner in return. In 779 AD, he issued the Capitulary of Herstal, mandating the tithe across his entire empire. Every Christian household was now legally obligated to surrender 1/10 of its annual income and produce to the church. This was not charity. It was law, enforced by Frankish counts and royal administrators across territories encompassing most of Western Europe. The financial consequences were staggering. Overnight, the church's revenue streams shifted from the voluntary and irregular to the systematic and mandatory. Grain poured into church granaries. Silver flowed into church coffers. Wealth accumulated at a pace that the patient estate building of previous centuries could never have matched. Two principles had now been established that would define the Vatican's power and prosperity for the next 1,000 years. First, that territory could be sacred, possessed not merely by men, but by God's institution on earth. Second, that temporal rulers derived their authority from the spiritual power that crowned them, and what could be given could, in theory, be taken away. The Pope had become kingmaker, sovereign, and spiritual father simultaneously. The next question was whether any institution or any emperor would ever dare challenge that extraordinary combination of power. With the Capitulary of Herstal transforming voluntary offerings into enforceable law, the machinery of church finance entered a new era. The question was no longer whether Christians would give. It was how much of what and to whom. The tithe had ancient roots. The book of Genesis records Abraham offering 1/10 of his spoils to the priest Melchizedek. Leviticus codified it for the Israelites. But for centuries, Christian tithing had remained largely aspirational, a moral expectation rather than a legal obligation. Charlemagne's Frankish enforcement changed everything. By the 9th century, church councils and royal edicts working in concert had transformed the tithe into the most comprehensive taxation system Western Europe had ever seen. And it applied to almost everything. Grain harvested from fields, lambs born in spring, honey collected from hives, flax, hemp, vegetables, wool, the young of cattle, and pigs. Agricultural communities surrendering 1/10 of their annual production faced a demand that felt, in lean years, like a genuine wound. Parish priests collected locally, keeping a portion for their own upkeep and passing the remainder upward through archdeacons, bishops, and ultimately toward Rome. The system was imperfect, riddled with local disputes and occasional corruption, but it functioned. The upward flow of wealth was relentless. Consider the scale. Carolingian Europe contained millions of farming households spread across present-day France, Germany, northern Italy, and beyond. Even modest and conservative estimates of agricultural output taxed at 10% across that geography, produced an almost incomprehensible volume of material wealth. Church granaries swelled. Church treasuries filled with silver coin. The institution that had once depended on imperial patronage and the generosity of pious nobles now possessed its own self-renewing financial engine. Meanwhile, the Papal States generated a different but equally important stream of revenue. The territories stretching across central Italy were not merely symbolic. They were productive land containing cities, ports, roads, and markets. Papal administrators collected rents from tenant farmers working church-owned land. Merchants moving goods through papal territories paid customs duties at checkpoints along the Via Flaminia and other major routes. Towns and cities within the Papal States paid taxes to Rome with the same regularity they had once paid to the Eastern Empire. This was sovereign income, the revenue of a functioning state. Popes appointed judges, maintained roads, settled commercial disputes, and issued documents carrying legal weight across the territories. The administrative machinery required to manage all of this, scribes, legates, regional governors, tax collectors, represented a substantial cost. But the revenues covered those costs and generated surplus. They also covered something far more expensive: military defense. The Papal States required soldiers. The 9th century was not a peaceful one. Arab raiders struck the Italian coast with alarming frequency, sacking the monastery of Monte Cassino in 843 and reaching the outskirts of Rome itself in 846. Norse raiders pressed southward through France. Rival Italian lords contested papal borders. Popes recruited and paid soldiers, built coastal defenses, and negotiated with Frankish and later with other regional powers for military support. War, even defensive war, was ruinous to treasuries. The Papal States absorbed these costs because the tithe and territorial revenues together made it possible. By the year 1000, the Church had constructed something with no precedent in the ancient world. A financial architecture that crossed every political boundary in Western Europe, drawing income from peasant farmers in England and wealthy merchants in northern Italy alike, funneling resources toward a single sovereign institution that answered to no emperor and no king. The wealth was real, tangible, and growing. But wealth on this scale attracted envy, and power on this scale attracted challengers. The centuries ahead would test whether Rome's financial foundations were strong enough to survive the conflicts they were already beginning to invite. While popes and bishops were constructing the machinery of tithes and territorial taxation, something equally consequential was happening in the valleys and hillsides of Europe. Thousands of men in rough wool robes were quietly building an empire of their own. It began as so much medieval history does, with a single document and a single man. In 529, a Roman nobleman named Benedict of Nursia established a monastery at Monte Cassino in central Italy and composed a set of rules governing how his monks would live. The Benedictine rule was precise, practical, and revolutionary. It divided the monk's day between prayer and labor, ora et labora, the Latin phrase that would define monastic life for centuries. Idleness was sin. Work was worship. And work, applied systematically across hundreds of monasteries, produced wealth on a staggering scale. Benedictine monks did not merely pray. They cleared forests in Germany and France, turning dense woodland into arable fields. They drained marshes in the English Fens and the Po Valley, reclaiming land that had been considered worthless for generations. They planted vineyards along the Rhine and the Rhone, establishing wine-producing regions that remain famous today. They built mills, operated fish ponds, bred livestock, and established brewing traditions that persisted for centuries. Every monastery became, in effect, a self-sufficient agricultural enterprise attached to the broader church economy. Noble families across Europe understood the opportunity this presented. Endowing a monastery with land was simultaneously an act of piety, a guarantee of prayers said for one's soul, and a practical investment in local economic development. Charters from the 8th through the 11th centuries record a continuous procession of donations, forests, meadows, mills, villages, entire river valleys transferred into monastic hands by counts, dukes, and kings seeking spiritual credit and earthly influence. By 900, Benedictine monasteries collectively controlled a significant fraction of the cultivated land in France and Germany. Then came the Cistercians. Founded in 1098 in Burgundy as a reform movement seeking stricter observance of Benedict's original rule, the Cistercians became medieval Europe's most formidable agricultural enterprise. They built deliberately in wilderness, in the isolated valleys and marginal lands that others had left untouched, and then transformed those landscapes through organized, disciplined labor. Within 2 generations, Cistercian monasteries were managing vast sheep runs in England, supplying raw wool to the cloth merchants of Flanders. They developed sophisticated accounting systems, maintained written records of harvests and sales, and operated with an efficiency that anticipated commercial agriculture by centuries. None of this wealth remained entirely local. Through a web of obligations, tributes, and ecclesiastical dues, the productive surplus of monasteries across Europe flowed steadily toward Rome. Land given to God, in practice, enriched the institution that claimed to speak for God. What the tithe extracted from peasants, the monasteries extracted from the earth itself, and both streams fed the same river. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd assembled in a field outside Clermont, in the Auvergne region of France, and delivered what may be the most consequential speech in medieval history. The Eastern Church was under threat, he told them. Jerusalem had fallen to Muslim rulers. Christian pilgrims were suffering. He called upon the knights and nobles of Europe to take up arms, promising that those who died in the effort would receive full remission of their sins. The crowd roared back with a single phrase, "God wills it." What followed was not merely a religious movement. It was a financial mobilization on a scale Europe had never seen. Launching a crusade required enormous sums. Armies had to be equipped, fed, and transported across thousands of miles. The Vatican, understanding this challenge, developed something startlingly modern, a system of dedicated military taxation. For the first time, the Church levied percentage-based taxes across entire kingdoms, assessed against both clergy and laity, with the explicit purpose of funding holy war. The 20th of 1291, known as the 6th of Lyons, required 1/6 of all clerical income across Christendom. These were not voluntary donations. They were compulsory extractions enforced with the threat of excommunication, and the revenues they generated flowed first through Rome. Yet even organized taxation could not solve the fundamental logistical problem. Crusaders needed money in France, but they needed it again in Constantinople, and again in Antioch, and again outside the walls of Jerusalem. How could wealth travel safely across a continent and a sea? Enter the Knights Templar. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Templars quickly evolved into something their founders almost certainly never imagined: the medieval world's first international banking network. A knight departing from Paris could deposit funds at a Templar house in France and receive a coded letter of credit redeemable at Templar stations across the Mediterranean. The system was elegant, secure, and enormously profitable. The Templars charged fees for these services, managed estates across Europe to generate operating capital, and accumulated reserves that made them indispensable to kings and popes alike. The Vatican's partnership with this network gave Rome direct access to the most sophisticated financial infrastructure of the age. Alongside taxes and banking came perhaps the most purely spiritual instrument of the Crusade economy, the indulgence. Granted first to those who physically took up the cross, indulgences were certificates of divine forgiveness, theoretically reducing a soul's time in purgatory. Over time, the definition expanded. Those who could not fight might purchase an indulgence instead. Those who funded another man's crusade received spiritual credit proportional to their investment. The line between salvation and transaction blurred with each passing decade, and the revenues accumulated accordingly. And when crusaders returned, they brought wealth with them. Silk, spices, Byzantine luxury goods, looted treasures from Constantinople after the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204. The Church claimed its portion at every stage, through taxation of returning knights, through the Templar networks that processed much of the trade, and through its position as the authorizing institution behind every expedition. By the time Acre, the last Crusader stronghold, fell in 1291, the crusading era had lasted nearly 2 centuries. The military campaigns had largely failed in their stated objectives. But the financial infrastructure they built, the taxation systems, the banking partnerships, the spiritual marketplace of indulgences, remained intact. The Church had learned something invaluable. War, properly administered, could be extraordinarily lucrative. And the tools developed to fund holy war would soon be turned toward targets much closer to home. The machinery was already in place. The theology simply needed to catch up. By the 13th century, church scholars had spent generations constructing a careful architecture of salvation. Sin required penance. Penance meant suffering, either in this life or the next. Purgatory, that intermediate state between death and paradise, was where the accounting happened. A soul might spend years, even centuries, burning away the residue of earthly transgression before ascending to heaven. The mathematics of the afterlife were terrifying, and the Church held the only calculator. The doctrine of indulgences offered relief. Drawing on what theologians called the treasury of merit, an inexhaustible spiritual reserve accumulated by Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, the Church claimed authority to transfer divine credit to individual souls. A pilgrimage completed, prayer recited, a donation made, these acts could reduce a sinner's time in purgatory. The logic was coherent within medieval theology. The problem was what happened when that logic met commerce. Pope Boniface VIII understood the opportunity clearly. In 1300, he declared the first papal jubilee, inviting all Christians to journey to Rome and receive a plenary indulgence, full remission of all accumulated sin. The response exceeded anything Rome had seen. Contemporary chroniclers described roads so crowded with pilgrims that the city felt as though it might collapse inward. Estimates suggest that 200,000 visitors arrived in that single year. They filled the churches, they pressed coins into offering boxes, and they departed carrying certificates of spiritual absolution. The papal treasury swelled accordingly. the Jubilee became a template. Subsequent popes refined and repeated it, eventually shortening the intervals between holy years, each iteration generating another surge of pilgrims and another tide of revenue. But Jubilees required travel. Most of Europe's faithful could not afford the journey to Rome. And so the indulgence trade came to them. Papal agents, known as quaestors, fanned out across Christendom carrying official indulgences for sale. They worked towns and villages, setting up in marketplaces and churches, offering certificates priced according to the buyer's means. The wealthy paid more for greater spiritual benefits. The poor could purchase something for whatever they carried. No town was too small to visit, no sin too ordinary to price. The phrase that eventually spread through popular culture captured the transaction with uncomfortable precision. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. The line, later associated with the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel in the following century, reflected a sentiment already circulating long before him. Salvation had become a commodity with a posted price. Not everyone was silent about this. By the late 14th century, voices within the church itself were growing uncomfortable. The English theologian John Wycliffe, writing in the 1370s and 80s, attacked the indulgence system as a corruption of Scripture, arguing that forgiveness belonged to God alone and could not be purchased through any earthly institution. In Bohemia, Jan Hus carried similar arguments to even larger audiences. Both men found themselves in profound conflict with Rome. Hus would eventually be burned as a heretic in 1415. Their objections were noted, suppressed, and largely ignored. The revenue was simply too significant to abandon. What reformers and ordinary believers alike were beginning to sense was something the Vatican had not yet fully acknowledged. The line between spiritual authority and financial exploitation had become very thin, and millions of people were starting to see through it. The Church had sold indulgences across 2 centuries of growing controversy. The backlash was building slowly, steadily, in pulpits and lecture halls and printing shops not yet invented. When the printing press arrived, that backlash would find a voice loud enough to split Christendom in two. While indulgence sellers were working the markets of Europe, the institution behind them was quietly reinventing itself. The papacy was no longer content to simply receive wealth. It was building the machinery to extract it systematically from every corner of Christendom with the precision of a counting house. It began with a crisis of geography. In 1309, Pope Clement V made a decision that would reshape the Church for nearly 7 decades. Caught between warring Italian factions and the overwhelming political pressure of the French crown, Clement abandoned Rome entirely and established the papal court in Avignon, a city nestled on the Rhone River in southern France. What was intended as a temporary measure became a permanent relocation. 7 successive popes would govern the Church from Avignon, never once setting foot in Rome. The critics were merciless. The poet Petrarch called it the Babylonian captivity of the Church, a papacy held hostage by French interests, severed from its spiritual roots. The accusation stung. But away from the chaos of Italian politics, something unexpected happened. Freed from constant crisis management, the Avignon popes turned their considerable energies toward administration. And administration meant finance. The apostolic camera became the nerve center of this new order. Originally a modest papal treasury, it was transformed at Avignon into one of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the medieval world. It maintained detailed records, employed trained accountants, and coordinated revenue collection across dozens of countries simultaneously. Historians have compared its bureaucratic complexity to that of modern multinational corporations. The comparison is not entirely flattering, but it is not entirely wrong. The revenue systems the camera administered were ingenious in their reach. Annats required newly appointed bishops and abbots to surrender the first year's income from their position directly to Rome. Servitia were fees paid upon receiving a papal appointment, calculated as a fraction of the office's assessed value. Every promotion, every confirmation, every transfer of church office generated a payment. The higher the position, the larger the sum. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, had technically been condemned for centuries. In practice, Avignon institutionalized it. Appointments flowed not only to the most pious or most qualified candidates, but reliably to those whose financial arrangements had been settled in advance. The church's human resources department had become a revenue stream. The weight of all this fell hardest on the lower clergy and on ordinary parishes, which found themselves supporting an increasingly distant and expensive headquarters through a cascade of fees they had little power to refuse. Then, in 1378, the system fractured. The Western Schism produced something medieval Christendom had never fully confronted. Two men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope, one in Rome and one back in Avignon. Within decades, a third claimant appeared. Each pope maintained a full court, a full bureaucracy, and a full appetite for revenue. Each demanded the loyalty and the payments of bishops and kingdoms across Europe. The faithful were left to choose between competing authorities, each excommunicating the other. The financial damage was staggering. Revenue that had once flowed to a single center was now split, contested, and duplicated across three rival administrations. Church resources that might have built cathedrals or funded scholars were consumed by political maneuvering and the maintenance of competing papal courts. The schism finally ended at the Council of Constance in 1417, but the wounds ran deep. The Church had demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that its spiritual claims and its financial machinery were inseparable. Remove the unity, and both suffered equally. What emerged from Constance was a papacy desperate to reassert its authority and rebuild its resources. It would do so by turning its attention south to the city it had abandoned, and to the extraordinary cultural project that would remake Rome entirely. Rome was ready to be remade. The popes who returned from Avignon and survived the schism inherited a city that had fallen into near ruin. Streets were unpaved, ancient aqueducts broken, the population reduced to perhaps 20,000 souls wandering among the crumbling monuments of empire. If the papacy was going to reassert its authority over Christendom, it needed to announce itself in stone, in gold, in color, and in genius. The Renaissance popes understood this with the instincts of showmen and the resources of princes. Nicholas V, who became pope in 1447, was the first to grasp the full scope of what was possible. A scholar of genuine brilliance, He founded the Vatican Library and stocked it with over 9,000 manuscripts, assembled by agents sent across Europe and into the Greek-speaking world as Byzantium collapsed. He commissioned new city walls, restored the Trevi Fountain's ancient source, and began ambitious plans for rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica itself. Nicholas understood that books and buildings were not luxuries. They were instruments of power, proof that Rome was once again the intellectual and spiritual capital of the world. Then came Sixtus IV. Between 1471 and 1484, the Pope, whose name would permanently grace the chapel he built, transformed papal patronage into an art form all its own. The Sistine Chapel, completed in 1481, was decorated by the greatest painters in Italy, among them Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino. Sixtus also opened the Vatican collections to the public, established the Vatican archives, and poured money into Rome's streets, bridges, and hospitals with an energy that would have impressed any civic booster. He was not above filling his treasury through aggressive taxation and the liberal appointment of relatives to profitable positions, a habit the era considered almost a papal birthright. No figure illustrated that habit more vividly than Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. Alexander was, by almost any measure, the Renaissance papacy's most spectacular contradiction. He fathered multiple children, publicly acknowledged them, and appointed his son Cesare to positions of military and political command. He threw lavish banquets in the Vatican's halls, maintained the court with the extravagance of a secular monarch, and extracted money from every available source with cheerful efficiency. Yet he was also a capable administrator who brought genuine order to the Papal States and understood perfectly how wealth and spiritual authority reinforced each other. His enemies, and there were many, called him the embodiment of church corruption. His defenders noted that the papacy had never been entirely innocent of worldly calculation. Both were correct. It was Julius II, Pope from 1503 to 1513, who elevated everything to its greatest height. Where Alexander had spent lavishly on pleasure and politics, Julius spent with the ambition of a pharaoh. In 1508, he commissioned a 33-year-old sculptor from Florence named Michelangelo Buonarroti to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The result, completed 4 years later in 1512, remains arguably the greatest single artistic achievement in Western history. Simultaneously, Julius hired Donato Bramante to demolish the ancient St. Peter's Basilica and begin an entirely new one, larger and more magnificent than anything Rome had ever contained. He brought Raphael to fresco the papal apartments. He assembled ancient sculptures into the Vatican's first public museum. The spending was almost incomprehensible. Where exactly did the money come from? Indulgences, annates, the revenues of the Papal States, gifts from grateful monarchs, fees extracted from every ecclesiastical appointment across Europe. The Vatican had become the greatest concentration of artistic and financial power the Western world had ever seen. Its treasury and its treasure house growing together in deliberate, mutually reinforcing splendor. By 1513, the Vatican was not merely the spiritual center of Christendom. It was its cultural capital, its greatest patron, and its most spectacular landlord. The popes had turned faith into an aesthetic experience so overwhelming that critics fell temporarily silent. But that silence would not last. A German monk was already reading his Bible very carefully and growing very angry. The old basilica had stood for nearly 1,200 years. Constantine the Great had built it over what tradition held was the tomb of St. Peter himself, and generation after generation of pilgrims had worn its marble floors smooth with their devotion. By the time Julius II turned his gaze upon it in 1506, it was crumbling, its walls leaning at dangerous angles, its foundations slowly surrendering to time. A lesser pope might have patched it. Julius II ordered it torn down entirely. What would replace it was to be the largest church on earth. The decision was staggering in its ambition and, as it turned out, in its consequences. Julius hired Donato Bramante, the greatest architect in Italy, to draft a new basilica built around a massive central dome. Construction began on April 18, 1506, and almost immediately the costs began to spiral beyond any reasonable estimate. Bramante alone spent so freely that Romans nicknamed him Bramante the Ruiner, a play on his name and his habits. When he died in 1514, the project passed to Raphael, then to Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, then, in 1547, to a 72-year-old Michelangelo, who redesigned the dome that would define the Roman skyline forever. After Michelangelo's death in 1564, Carlo Maderno extended the nave. Finally, Gian Lorenzo Bernini completed the Great Piazza and its sweeping colonnades, finished in 1667. From first stone to final consecration in 1626, the basilica consumed 120 years and the energies of at least 6 master architects. It also consumed an almost unimaginable quantity of money. To fund the construction, Pope Leo X, Julius's successor, authorized an aggressive new campaign of indulgence sales across Europe. The logic was familiar, but the scale was not. A Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel took the campaign into German territories with the enthusiasm of a traveling salesman, reportedly assuring crowds that the moment a coin clinked in his collection box, a soul leapt free of purgatory. The slogan, whether Tetzel actually coined it or not, captured the spirit of the enterprise perfectly. The poor were being asked to pay for the grandest building project in Christendom, and they knew it. In Wittenberg, a theology professor named Martin Luther was already troubled by what he saw as the church's corruption. In October 1517, he published his 95 Theses, targeting indulgences directly. The sale of God's grace to fund a pope's vanity project was, to Luther, not a symptom of the church's problems. It was the disease itself. The Protestant Reformation, which would fracture Western Christianity permanently, had found its spark in a building budget. The irony was rich and terrible. The basilica meant to glorify the church's authority helped destroy its unity. Yet, the building rose. Through schism and scandal, through the sack of Rome in 1527, through the upheavals of a century and a quarter, the dome climbed into the Roman sky. When the basilica was finally consecrated under Pope Urban VIII on November 18, 1626, it stretched over 600 feet in length and could hold more than 60,000 worshippers beneath its vaults. Bernini's Piazza, with its twin colonnades stretching like welcoming arms toward the city, announced that Rome's power was absolute and eternal. The basilica stood as the supreme monument to what the Vatican had become, an institution that could reshape the physical world, command the greatest artists of every generation, and spend across centuries without ever going dark. What made such spending possible was a financial machinery far more sophisticated than most of its critics understood. The spark had already been struck. As the previous chapter showed, it was the indulgence campaign funding St. Peter's that handed Martin Luther his most devastating argument. Now that argument would echo across an entire continent. On the morning of October 31st, 1517, a 33-year-old Augustinian friar walked to the castle church in Wittenberg and, according to tradition, nailed a document to its wooden door. The 95 Theses were not, at first glance, a revolutionary manifesto. They were an academic invitation to debate, written in Latin, directed at theologians. But their central target was explosive. Luther was attacking indulgences, the very financial instrument the church had come to depend upon, and in doing so he was attacking the logic that bound money to salvation itself. The printing press did the rest. Within weeks, translated copies had spread across Germany. Within months, they had reached every corner of Europe. The church had spent a century building the most sophisticated revenue collection network the Western world had ever seen. And now a theology professor was telling ordinary people that the entire system was a fraud. Luther's theological assault did not stop at indulgences. He attacked simony, the buying and selling of church offices, a practice so common it had its own name. He attacked the wealth of bishops who lived as princes while peasants scraped for coin. He attacked Rome itself, describing it in terms that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Vatican's financial model, built on the assumption of universal Catholic loyalty, had never faced a challenge like this. The consequences arrived with stunning speed. In 1534, King Henry VIII of England broke with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. His motivations were dynastic rather than theological, centered on his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but the financial implications dwarfed the personal drama. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry's government dissolved over 800 monasteries across England and Wales. Their lands, their livestock, their gold plate, their libraries, everything passed into royal hands. Historians estimate the total seizure represented something approaching the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. It was the largest transfer of property in English history since the Norman Conquest, and it happened in less than 5 years. England was only the most dramatic example. Across Scandinavia, across the German principalities, across Switzerland and the Netherlands, Protestant rulers followed similar paths. Church properties were seized. Tithes were redirected. The elaborate financial infrastructure the medieval church had constructed over centuries, the monasteries, the cathedral chapters, the networks of parish payments flowing upward toward Rome, was dismantled region by region. The numbers were catastrophic. Northern Europe, which had represented some of the most productive and disciplined Catholic territory on the continent, simply stopped sending money south. The tithe stopped. The indulgence revenues collapsed. The Peter's pence, the ancient annual payment flowing from England to Rome since the 9th century, ended abruptly. Could the church survive such losses? The answer, as it turned out, was yes, though not without profound transformation. The Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, formalized what had become undeniable. The principle it established, that the religion of a territory would follow the religion of its ruler, acknowledged that Christian Europe was permanently divided. The Vatican lost formal authority over vast swaths of the continent, and with that authority went the revenues those territories had generated for 1,000 years. And yet the crisis forced something remarkable. Stripped of easy income from the north, the Catholic Church was compelled to reorganize, to look elsewhere, to find new sources of wealth and influence. The Counter-Reformation, already gathering momentum, would push Catholic missionaries into the Americas, into Asia, into Africa, opening financial horizons that the reformers in Wittenberg and London could never have imagined. The loss of Northern Europe was real and devastating. But the world was growing larger, and Rome was already turning its gaze toward it. The world was growing larger indeed, and Rome moved quickly to claim it. When Columbus made landfall in 1492, the implications were not merely geographic. They were theological, political, and ultimately financial on a scale no one yet understood. Within 3 years, Pope Alexander VI had issued a series of papal bulls, the most consequential being Inter Caetera, drawing an invisible line across the Atlantic Ocean. Spain would control everything to the west. Portugal would control everything to the east. The papacy, with a stroke of a pen, had divided an entire hemisphere between two Catholic powers, and in doing so had bound the wealth of the New World to Catholic authority before a single mine had been dug. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 moved that line westward at Portuguese insistence, but the principle remained unchanged. The Pope had spoken. 2 kingdoms had obeyed, and the treasure that followed would flow, in part, back toward Rome. It was against this backdrop that the Council of Trent convened in 1545. Running in 3 separate sessions across 18 years, the Council was the Vatican's most serious attempt at internal reform since the chaos of the Avignon period. It addressed corruption in the priesthood, tightened standards for the sale of church offices, reformed the training of clergy, and clarified doctrinal positions that Protestant critics had successfully muddied. But it also quietly restructured church finances, replacing some of the cruder revenue mechanisms that Luther had so effectively attacked with more defensible and durable systems. The spiritual renewal was genuine. The financial reorganization was equally serious. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola and formally approved in 1540. The Jesuits became the Vatican's most effective instrument in the Counter-Reformation, but their missions in South America generated something else entirely: an economic empire. In Paraguay and Brazil, Jesuit reductions, organized communities of indigenous converts, grew into extraordinary productive enterprises. They cultivated yerba mate, raised cattle, and manufactured goods on a scale that made them among the most efficient agricultural operations in the Western Hemisphere. The wealth they generated was substantial. Critics, including eventually the Spanish and Portuguese crowns that had originally welcomed them, came to see the Jesuit economic network as a rival power within their own colonial territories. That tension would eventually prove fatal for the order, but for a century the Jesuits channeled enormous resources through Catholic networks tied ultimately back to Rome. Meanwhile, the broader flow of colonial wealth through Catholic Europe was staggering. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish ships carried approximately 180,000 tons of silver from the mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia to European ports. The human cost was catastrophic for the indigenous and enslaved African laborers who extracted it. But Catholic institutions on both sides of the Atlantic were positioned to capture portions of this flow. Churches, cathedrals, and religious orders across Spain, Portugal, and their colonial possessions were built, endowed, and enriched by New World metal. The tithe system followed the conquistadors. Where Catholic parishes were established, the obligation to pay followed. And while Northern European reformers were dismantling church revenue structures in Wittenberg and London, the church was building entirely new ones in Lima, Mexico City, and Goa. By the time the 30 Years' War finally exhausted itself with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the map of European religion had hardened into something close to its modern form. The Vatican had permanently lost the North. But it had found something far larger. And the financial architecture it built around colonial wealth would shape the church's fortunes for centuries to come, raising uncomfortable questions about gold, power, and the price of salvation that echo into the present day. The Peace of Westphalia had settled the wars of religion, but it had not settled the Vatican's appetite for magnificence. If the 16th century was the age of doctrine and crisis, the 17th was the age of stone and spectacle. Rome would answer the Protestant Reformation not with argument alone, but with something more immediate, more overwhelming, more impossible to ignore. It would answer with beauty, and no single figure embodied that ambition more completely than Gian Lorenzo Bernini. From the 1620s onward, Bernini transformed the face of Rome with a confidence that bordered on the divine. His baldachin inside St. Peter's Basilica, completed in 1634, rose nearly 30 meters above the tomb of the apostle himself, a bronze canopy so enormous that critics joked the bronze had been stolen from the Pantheon. They were not entirely wrong, but nothing Bernini produced could prepare visitors for what came next. Between 1656 and 1667, he designed the great colonnaded piazza embracing St. Peter's Square, two sweeping curved arms of columns reaching outward like the arms of the church itself. Bernini described them exactly that way. The imagery was intentional. The cost was extraordinary. And therein lay the paradox at the heart of 17th century Vatican finance. The church was producing the most spectacular art and architecture the Western world had ever seen, and it was doing so largely on borrowed money. The instrument of that borrowing had a name: the Monti. These were essentially papal bonds, certificates of debt sold to investors in exchange for annual interest payments. The system had existed in earlier forms, but the 17th century saw it mature into something resembling a modern public debt market. Roman noble families, wealthy merchants, and foreign investors purchased Monti shares as a reliable church-backed investment. The Vatican, in turn, used the proceeds to fund everything from military campaigns to fountains. The fountains were not metaphorical. Rome's elaborate waterworks, its grand piazzas, its church facades, its ceremonial processions and canonizations staged as theatrical events for tens of thousands of pilgrims, all of it required continuous expenditure. Papal ceremonies alone consumed budgets that would strain a modest principality. Meanwhile, the revenues underpinning all of this were quietly eroding. The Papal States, the Vatican's territorial base across central Italy, were poorly administered and chronically undertaxed compared to the emerging nation-states of Northern Europe. Agricultural productivity lagged. Trade routes had shifted toward the Atlantic and away from the Mediterranean ports Rome had historically taxed. The colonial windfall that had enriched Catholic Spain was never fully Rome's to command. By the century's end, the papacy carried debts that would haunt its finances well into the next century. It had given the world Bernini. It had given Rome an identity as the city of eternal grandeur. But it had paid for that grandeur with promises, and collecting on promises would prove far harder than laying foundations. The ledgers were troubled. The ceilings were magnificent, and the tension between those two facts would define what came next. The debts Bernini's Rome had accumulated did not go unnoticed. But the threat that arrived in the 18th century was not another Protestant revolt or a rival army at the gates. It came instead from libraries, salons, and printing houses, carried by men armed with nothing more dangerous than ideas. Voltaire mocked the church's temporal wealth with savage wit. Rousseau questioned whether any institution claiming divine authority could justify earthly empire. John Locke's writings on the separation of civil and religious power circulated across Catholic Europe, finding readers in places the Vatican had assumed were safely faithful. These were not marginal voices. By the 1740s and 1750s, Enlightenment thinking had penetrated the courts of France, Spain, Portugal, and Austria, kingdoms that had historically served as the papacy's closest protectors and most generous patrons. The consequences were financial before they were philosophical. Catholic monarchs across Europe began asking a question their predecessors had rarely dared voice openly. Why were the church's revenues flowing toward Rome rather than serving their own kingdoms? The Spanish crown tightened its grip on ecclesiastical appointments and incomes. The French monarchy extended its long tradition of Gallicanism, insisting that church authority within France answered first to Paris, not to the Pope. Portugal's powerful minister Marquis of Pombal moved aggressively to subordinate church institutions to state control through the 1750s and 1760s. Rome watched as its financial pipelines, built over centuries, were rerouted one by one. Then came the blow that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could soften. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV signed the brief Dominus Ac Redemptor, suppressing the Society of Jesus entirely. The Jesuits, founded in 1540, had become the Vatican's most effective global instrument, running schools, missions, universities, and networks of influence stretching from Paraguay to the Philippines. They had also accumulated extraordinary wealth, plantations in South America, colleges across Europe, trading relationships that rivaled those of secular merchants. Catholic monarchs had already expelled them from their territories throughout the 1760s, seizing Jesuit properties as they went. The suppression simply completed the dismantling, and the assets that remained under church oversight were absorbed by governments' rival orders or simply dissolved into competing claims. The Jesuits' fall illustrated something the Vatican had not yet fully absorbed. Wealth held through institutions, no matter how venerable, required political protection to survive. And the political will to protect Rome's financial interests was evaporating. By 1789, the Papal States remained intact on the map, but their authority in European power politics had diminished to something approaching symbolic. The papacy could still crown, could still excommunicate, could still fill St. Peter's Square with the faithful. What it could no longer do reliably was dictate terms to the continent's great powers. The Enlightenment had not destroyed the Church, but it had exposed the gap between its spiritual claims and its earthly vulnerabilities at precisely the wrong moment. Across the Alps, something far more violent was about to begin. What arrived from across the Alps was not merely an army. It was an idea with cannons behind it. The French Revolution, erupting in 1789, transformed the vague philosophical pressures of the Enlightenment into something immediate and brutal. Within France, the National Assembly moved against church property with breathtaking speed. In November of 1789, it nationalized all ecclesiastical lands, an act that stripped the French Church of roughly 10% of the entire nation's territory overnight. Then came the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, which subordinated French priests and bishops to the French state, demanding oaths of loyalty that cut directly across papal authority. Rome refused to accept it. The revolution didn't particularly care. Could the Vatican have imagined, even in its most anxious moments, what was about to follow? When Napoleon Bonaparte led his armies into Italy in 1796, the Papal States lay directly in his path. He moved through them with the casual confidence of a man who recognized weakness when he encountered it. The looting that followed was not random pillage. It was systematic, even bureaucratic. Napoleon dispatched expert commissioners alongside his troops, men who walked through Vatican libraries, galleries, and treasuries with lists in hand. The numbers were staggering. The Treaty of Tolentino, signed in February of 1797, forced Pope Pius VI to surrender 100 paintings, 500 manuscripts, and 100 objects of art and science, along with an indemnity of 30 million livres in cash. The Laocoon, the Apollo Belvedere, works that had defined the Vatican's collection since the Renaissance, were crated and sent to Paris. The financial blow was immense, but the symbolic wound cut deeper still. These objects had represented the papacy's claim to be the guardian of Western civilization itself. Worse was coming. In 1798, French forces occupied Rome entirely. The Roman Republic was declared, and Pius VI, elderly and physically failing, was taken prisoner and removed from the city he had governed for over 2 decades. He was transported across the Alps, despite his deteriorating health, and died in French captivity in Valence in August of 1799. The papacy, the oldest continuous institution in Western history, appeared to have simply ended. Voltaire's famously attributed prediction that Christianity would be extinct within 50 years seemed to be arriving ahead of schedule. It did not end, of course. The conclave that gathered in Venice in 1800 elected a new pope, Pius VII, under circumstances of extraordinary uncertainty. Napoleon, now in firm control of France, recognized that the Church retained something no army could fully capture: its hold on the loyalties of millions. The Concordat of 1801 normalized relations between France and the papacy, a pragmatic arrangement that suited both parties temporarily. But temporary was the operative word. Napoleon kidnapped Pius VII in 1809, holding him prisoner for 5 years. Only Napoleon's catastrophic defeat and final exile in 1815 brought genuine relief. The Congress of Vienna returned the Papal States to papal control that same year. The territories were back on the map. The institution had survived. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The Vatican's treasuries were depleted, its political prestige was battered, and a new and dangerous question now circulated openly in European capitals. If the Pope could be kidnapped twice in 16 years, if his treasures could be carted to Paris, if his states could be occupied without lasting consequence, what exactly was the nature of his power? The answer to that question would define the Vatican's next great financial transformation, one that would ultimately prove more consequential than anything Napoleon had destroyed. The question Napoleon had forced upon the papacy, that unsettling inquiry into the true nature of papal power, would receive its most brutal answer not from a foreign conqueror but from Italy itself. By 1848, the revolutionary fires that periodically swept Europe had reached the Italian peninsula. The Risorgimento, the movement for Italian national unification, gathered momentum through the 1850s and into the 1860s under the determined leadership of the House of Savoy and their brilliant Prime Minister, Count Camillo de Cavour. Their project was straightforward and, from the Vatican's perspective, catastrophic. A unified Italian nation required a capital. That capital would be Rome, and Rome still belonged to the Pope. Piece by piece, the Papal States were absorbed. By 1860, the Church had lost the Romagna, the Marche, and Umbria, territories it had governed for centuries. French troops stationed in Rome provided a final buffer, but when the Franco-Prussian War forced Napoleon III to withdraw them in 1870, that buffer evaporated overnight. On the 20th of September, 1870, Italian troops breached the Aurelian Wall at Porta Pia after a cannonade lasting barely 3 hours. Rome fell in a single morning. The Papal States, a political entity stretching back over 11 centuries, ceased to exist before lunchtime. Pope Pius IX's response was remarkable in its theatrical defiance. He refused any accommodation with the Italian state, declared himself a prisoner within the Vatican walls, and simply never left. For the remaining 8 years of his life, he did not cross the threshold into the city that had once been his. His successors would maintain this self-imposed confinement for nearly 60 years. The Italian government, eager to avoid international outrage from Catholic nations, passed the Law of Guarantees in 1871. It offered the Pope a generous annual payment, sovereignty over the Vatican buildings, and various diplomatic courtesies. Pius IX rejected it entirely. Accepting compensation, he understood, would mean legitimizing the theft. The Vatican would not touch Italian money, which created a pressing practical problem. The papal treasury had lost its tax base. It had lost its territories, its toll revenues, its agricultural rents, all the financial machinery of a functioning state. How would the Church sustain itself? The answer had actually begun taking shape before the walls fell. As early as 1859, Pius IX had revived and dramatically expanded an ancient tradition, Peter's Pence. The concept dated to medieval England, a small annual contribution from Catholic households to Rome. Now it was reimagined as something far more sophisticated. A global fundraising campaign, organized through the Church's network of bishops and parishes across every continent, asked ordinary Catholics to donate directly to the Pope as a personal act of devotion. The response was extraordinary. Catholics in Ireland, in America, in South America, in France and Germany sent contributions ranging from pennies to substantial sums. The Vatican was, for the first time, drawing systematic financial sustenance not from territorial sovereignty, but from the voluntary loyalty of its worldwide congregation. Millions of individual donors replaced the tax revenues of an Italian province. It was, in retrospect, a transformation of staggering long-term significance. The loss of the Papal States had looked like a death blow. Instead, it severed the Church's dependence on a single geographic territory and redirected its financial foundations towards something far more durable, a global network of faithful contributors that no army could occupy and no nationalist government could confiscate. The prisoner of the Vatican was, quietly and methodically, building a new kind of empire. One without borders, without armies, and with deeper roots than any territorial state had ever managed to put down. For nearly 60 years, that peculiar standoff persisted. Pope after pope confined himself to the Vatican's few acres, refusing to set foot in Rome, refusing to recognize the Italian state that had swallowed his territories whole. The Roman question, as diplomats called it, had become one of the most stubborn, unresolved tensions in European politics. Then came Benito Mussolini. The fascist dictator who seized power in 1922 was not, by any serious measure, a devout man. But he was a calculating one. Mussolini understood that reconciling with the Church would grant his regime something it desperately needed: legitimacy in the eyes of Italy's overwhelmingly Catholic population. For the Vatican's part, a new Italian government presented a new opportunity. The Church had waited long enough. Negotiations began in earnest through the mid-1920s, conducted with considerable secrecy. On the 11th of February, 1929, in the Lateran Palace beside the Basilica of St. John, Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Mussolini sat across from each other and signed 3 documents that would reshape the map of Rome and the finances of the Church forever. The Lateran Treaty did several things simultaneously. It formally recognized Italian sovereignty over the former papal states, ending the 60-year standoff. In return, Italy recognized the full sovereignty of Vatican City, a precisely demarcated territory of just under half a square kilometer in the heart of Rome, the smallest internationally recognized nation on earth. The Pope was no longer a self-proclaimed prisoner. He was a head of state. And then there was the money. The financial settlement accompanying the treaty was staggering by the standards of the era. Italy agreed to pay the Holy See 750 million lire in cash, plus an additional 1 billion lire in Italian government bonds. The total sum, intended as compensation for the loss of the Papal States nearly 6 decades earlier, represented what many economists estimated as roughly $1 billion in modern purchasing power. The Church, which had refused Italian money on principle since 1871, now accepted it in quantities that made the original law of guarantees look modest. The question immediately was what to do with it. Pope Pius XI had the wisdom to recognize that he needed expertise far beyond the Vatican's traditional financial circles. He founded in a quiet, precise Sicilian banker named Bernardino Nogara. Nogara was not a priest, not a theologian, and not a sentimentalist about how the money should be deployed. He was a professional with decades of experience in international finance and metals trading. When Pius XI appointed him to manage the settlement funds in 1929, Nogara accepted on one condition: he would face no religious restrictions on his investment decisions. The Pope agreed. What followed was a masterclass in financial expansion. Nogara moved the settlement funds into international equities, real estate across Europe, gold holdings, and Swiss financial markets. He diversified aggressively, shielded Vatican assets behind a web of holding companies, and proved particularly adept at navigating the turbulent economic conditions of the 1930s. While the Great Depression battered portfolios across the Western world, Nogara's careful positioning kept Vatican finances not merely intact but growing. By the time of his retirement in 1954, Nogara had transformed a one-time diplomatic payment into the foundation of a genuinely global investment portfolio. The seed money from Mussolini's government had multiplied into something the papacy had never possessed before: Not land, not territory, not the rents of Italian peasants, but liquid, international, modern capital. The Vatican had entered the 20th century's financial system. What it would build from that foundation would, in time, astonish even those who thought they understood the Church's reach. On the 27th of June, 1942, with Europe locked in the worst conflict in human history, Pope Pius XII signed a quiet document that would have consequences no wartime observer could have predicted. The Institute for the Works of Religion, known by its Italian initials as the IOR, was formally established. Its stated purpose was modest: to manage funds held in trust for religious works and Catholic missions worldwide. Its actual significance was something else entirely. From the moment of its founding, the Vatican Bank occupied a position unlike any financial institution on earth. It operated within the borders of a sovereign state, subject to no national banking regulator, answerable to no external authority. Italy's financial laws did not apply. No international oversight body held jurisdiction. There were no required public disclosures, no external audits, no annual reports published for scrutiny. The IOR existed, as one observer later put it, in a financial jurisdiction of its own invention. Bernardino Nogara, still at the height of his powers in the early 1940s, used this structure with remarkable efficiency. The investments he had built through the 1930s now had an institutional home, a sovereign shell that insulated Vatican capital from the inquiries that any ordinary bank would face. Accounts held at the IOR carried the protection of Vatican sovereignty. Transfers moved through it without the paper trails that Italian tax authorities could follow. The post-war period accelerated everything. As Italy rebuilt through the late 1940s and 1950s, the Vatican was positioned as one of the country's most significant institutional investors. Nogara held stakes in Italian insurance companies, utilities, and industrial firms. Vatican-linked holding companies held real estate across Rome, including substantial properties that the Lateran settlement funds had quietly purchased in the years since 1929. By conservative estimates, the Vatican's Roman real estate holdings alone, apartment buildings, commercial properties, palaces, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The portfolio extended far beyond Italy's borders. Swiss banks held Vatican accounts. Investments reached into French and British markets. Real estate holdings appeared in other European capitals. Nogara had ensured that the Vatican's wealth was distributed, diversified, and, critically, difficult to trace in its entirety, even for those within the Church who might have wished to understand the full picture. And what was the full picture? Nobody outside the Vatican's innermost financial circle could say with confidence. That opacity was not an accident. It was the architecture. The IOR issued no statements, held no press conferences, published no figures. Popes received briefings. Cardinals on the relevant supervisory bodies received selective information. The broader Church, to say nothing of the Catholic faithful whose donations flowed through Vatican channels, knew almost nothing about how those funds were managed or where they resided. By the time Nogara retired in 1954, the institution he had shaped was generating returns and controlling assets that placed it among the most consequential financial entities in post-war Europe. His successors inherited not just a portfolio but a system, a sovereign financial architecture specifically designed to accumulate without accountability. Through the 1960s, that architecture attracted attention of a different kind. The IOR's unique status made it appealing not just to church entities, but to outsiders who recognized what a bank beyond regulatory reach could offer. The Vatican had built something extraordinary. Whether it could control what that something would become was a question the 1970s would answer in ways no one inside those ancient walls had anticipated. The man at the center of the storm stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, a former seminary basketball coach from Chicago who had risen improbably to become the most powerful banker in the history of the Catholic Church. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus took control of the Institute for the Works of Religion in 1971, and his philosophy was direct. "You can't run the church on Hail Marys," he reportedly told those who questioned his methods. What Marcinkus ran it on, it would emerge, was something far more dangerous. The IOR's sovereign architecture, built so carefully over the previous decades, had by the early 1970s attracted exactly the kind of outside interest that should have raised alarm. Roberto Calvi, the Milan-based chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks, had found in the Vatican Bank an extraordinary partner. Calvi was brilliant, secretive, and connected to networks that stretched into shadows most bankers preferred not to examine. He was a member of Propaganda Do, known as P2, a clandestine Masonic lodge that Italian investigators would later describe as a state within a state, counting politicians, military officers, intelligence figures, and organized crime associates among its membership. Through the 1970s, Calvi and Marcinkus constructed a financial relationship of remarkable complexity. The Vatican Bank held accounts and shares in Banco Ambrosiano subsidiaries. Vatican-linked shell companies in Luxembourg and Panama received transfers. Money moved through layers of holding structures that obscured its origins and destinations. Investigators who later tried to reconstruct the flows described it as deliberately labyrinthine. What was being hidden? The full answer has never been established to anyone's complete satisfaction. What investigators found was evidence of massive fraud. Loans totaling more than $1 billion had been extended by Banco Ambrosiano's Latin American subsidiaries to shell companies that existed on paper alone. The collateral for those loans, in many cases, were letters of comfort signed by the Vatican Bank, documents suggesting the IOR stood behind the phantom entities. In June of 1982, Roberto Calvi was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets weighted with bricks and cash. Italian authorities initially ruled his death a suicide. Decades of subsequent investigation and a 2005 Italian court proceeding pointed elsewhere. Calvi had reportedly told associates in his final days that he feared for his life. The man journalists had nicknamed God's banker died with his secrets largely intact. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano that followed was the largest bank failure in Italian history to that point. The losses linked to Vatican bank accounts reached $1.3 billion. Depositors, creditors, and the Italian state were left to absorb consequences that radiated outward for years. The Vatican's initial response was denial. Marcinkus insisted the IOR had no legal liability. Italian prosecutors saw it differently. For years, Marcinkus lived effectively inside Vatican walls, protected by sovereign immunity from Italian arrest warrants that named him in the investigation. The settlement, when it finally came, was telling. In 1984, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors, describing the payment not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as a recognition of moral involvement. The phrase satisfied no one. least of all those who had watched $1 billion vanish through structures the Vatican had certified. Marcinkus remained in his post until 1989. No criminal conviction ever reached him. The full accounting of where the money went, who authorized what, and how deeply organized crime had penetrated the Vatican's financial relationships was never delivered in any courtroom. What the scandal did deliver was something the Church had spent decades preventing. For the first time, the world was looking very closely at the IR's books, and what they could see raised questions that would take decades more to begin answering. What lies behind the scandal, behind the bank, behind the centuries of accumulated power? The answer is a fortune so vast, so deliberately obscured, that even the most sophisticated financial analysts struggle to place a number on it. Begin with what can be seen. The Vatican museums draw roughly 6 million visitors each year, winding through gallery after gallery of objects that represent the concentrated artistic output of Western civilization. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, completed by Michelangelo in 1512 after 4 years of labor, is insured for nothing, because no insurer on earth could cover its loss. Raphael rooms, the Laocoon sculpture, the collection of ancient maps, the Egyptian antiquities gathered over centuries of papal acquisition, all of it sits beyond conventional valuation. Art economists who have attempted partial estimates place the cultural holdings of the Vatican at somewhere between $10 billion and $15 billion. Others argue the figure is meaningless because these objects will never be sold, and a price that can never be tested in a market is not really a price at all. Then there is the real estate. The Vatican's property holdings extend across more than 5,000 individual properties worldwide. Prime addresses in London, Paris, Geneva, and across Italy represent assets accumulated through centuries of donation, inheritance, and strategic purchase. The Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples alone, once known as Propaganda Fide, controls some of the most valuable parcels in central Rome. A 2012 report by Italian financial investigators estimated the Vatican's Italian real estate portfolio alone at several billion euros, much of it rented at below market rates to favored tenants, which raises its own questions about how wealth is being used and who benefits. Beyond Rome, the gold. Vatican gold reserves, accumulated over centuries and supplemented during the Lateran Treaty settlement of 1929, are stored not beneath St. Peter's Square, but at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Bank of England. The quantities are not publicly disclosed. The investment portfolios managed through the Secretariat of State and various Vatican entities span equities, bonds, and sovereign instruments across multiple continents. And here is the fundamental problem. The Vatican has never published a complete balance sheet. Not once. The partial financial disclosures that have emerged since 1992 reflect only selected portions of a far larger picture. Analysts working from property records, court documents, leaked internal reports, and the testimony of former officials estimate total Vatican wealth somewhere between $10 billion and $30 billion. The range itself tells the story. No one actually knows. What is certain is this. The institution that began with 12 fishermen and a carpenter's son from Galilee has, over 2,000 years, constructed a financial architecture of extraordinary complexity, answering to no government, no regulator, and no shareholder. Whether that architecture serves its sacred mission or has grown beyond it is perhaps the oldest question in Christendom. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica on the evening of March 13, 2013, he did something no pope had done in living memory. He bowed his head and asked the crowd to pray for him. It was a small gesture, but the world noticed. Here, perhaps, was something different. Francis had come from Buenos Aires, the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit to hold the office. He rode buses. He carried his own luggage. He moved into a Vatican guest house rather than the apostolic palace. And from the very beginning, he made clear that the financial culture of the institution he now led was, in his words, a problem that could no longer be ignored. His first concrete move came in 2014 with the creation of the Secretariat for the Economy, a new body placed under the direction of Australian Cardinal George Pell. For the first time in Vatican history, an external firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, was engaged to conduct independent audits. The symbolism was enormous. The results were troubling. Auditors discovered hundreds of millions of euros sitting in accounts that had never appeared in any official Vatican budget. The money had not been hidden through elaborate conspiracy. It had simply never been reported because no one had ever required it to be. Then came the scandal that became impossible to contain. The Secretariat of State, using funds from Peter's pence, the donations that ordinary Catholics around the world contribute to the Pope's charitable work, had invested heavily in a luxury residential development in the Chelsea neighborhood of London. The property had been acquired in 2012 for 200 million euros. By the time the full picture emerged, the investment had bled the Vatican of hundreds of millions more through fees, loans, and mismanagement. An institution that asked the faithful for charitable contributions had been using those contributions to speculate in London real estate. The criminal consequences were historic. In 2023, Cardinal Angelo Becciu became the first cardinal in modern history to be convicted of financial crimes by a Vatican court. He received a sentence of 5.5 years. The trial had lasted nearly 2 years and exposed a culture of parallel loyalties, informal networks, and institutional habits that no reorganization chart could easily untangle. And that resistance has proven stubborn. George Pell, before his own separate legal troubles in Australia, complained openly that his reform efforts were being blocked from within. Auditors found their access quietly restricted. Departments continued to operate with degrees of financial independence that made consolidated oversight nearly impossible. What Francis has built is real. External audits now exist where none existed before. A framework for accountability has been constructed. But the Vatican is an institution 2,000 years in the making, and 2,000 years of accumulated habit do not dissolve in a single pontificate. The question he leaves unresolved is the same one his predecessors left unanswered. Who ultimately watches the watchers? 2,000 years. That is how long it took for a movement born in poverty, on the margins of a vast empire, to become what the Vatican is today. And what exactly is that? The honest answer is that no one knows precisely. Estimates of total Vatican wealth range from $100 billion to several times that figure, depending on which assets are included and how they are valued. The art alone, the Raphael frescoes, the ancient manuscripts, the sculpture that lines every corridor of the Vatican museums is effectively priceless. It cannot be sold. It cannot be meaningfully appraised. It simply exists, vast and immovable, a civilization's worth of accumulated treasure. Add the real estate holdings spread across Rome and beyond. Add the investment portfolios, the gold reserves, the media operations, the institutional endowments. The Vatican's financial footprint begins to resemble not a church but a sovereign wealth fund, a small nation's economy administered from the smallest nation on earth. And here lies the tension that no papal decree has ever resolved. The man this institution venerates as its founder told his followers to sell what they owned and give it to the poor. He said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. These are not obscure passages. They sit at the center of the gospel. Every cardinal who has ever managed a Vatican investment portfolio has read them. The Vatican's defenders point to its charitable work. The hospitals, the schools, the relief organizations operating in some of the poorest regions on earth. They are right that this work is real and substantial. But charitable spending, by most credible estimates, represents a fraction of what the institution manages, invests, and holds. The gap between what is given away and what is accumulated remains, by any honest accounting, enormous. Perhaps the more searching question is not whether the Vatican's wealth is justified, but what it costs in terms of credibility. When the institution speaks on behalf of the poor, on economic justice, on the dignity of those without resources, how much authority does it carry from behind walls that contain one of the greatest concentrations of private wealth on the planet? History suggests that people have always been willing to hold these contradictions alongside their faith. Across 20 centuries of scandal, corruption, and reform, the institution has endured. It has outlasted empires, survived schisms, and absorbed revelations that would have destroyed any merely human organization. Whether it can continue to do so in an age of transparency, in a world where financial records can be demanded, and the patience of the faithful is not unconditional, remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is this: the journey from a collection plate passed among persecuted believers in the catacombs of Rome to the wealthiest institution in human history is one of the most remarkable stories power has ever told about itself. From the catacombs of ancient Rome to the gilded halls of a sovereign state, the Vatican's story is a masterclass in how power, faith, and fortune intertwine across 2,000 years. Subscribe for more histories that reveal the forces quietly shaping our world.